Welcome everybody on behalf of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. We're so glad to see everybody. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge our board chair, Sean Minahan, who's helping with this evening tonight and doing tech support. So much thanks to him. I'm going to let you do the admissions for these next few minutes, and then I'll help out Sean. And I also want to acknowledge, I want to acknowledge Marge Ropp, our valiant volunteer who's among the masses on this screen. We are the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, a small nonprofit in the city of Worcester that has a mission of peace education. And our programs over the past decade have taken many forms, including school programming. We do a peer mediation program at one of the local high schools. We've also done dramatic presentations on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their early history as told by women. And we do presentations for the general public. And COVID has made it possible for us to do that more frequently. So for 2021, we're going to try to do monthly presentations. Some of you were with us in January when we showed the Third Harmony, which looks at nonviolence through a documentary, an excellent documentary that was done by the Meta Center. Next month in March, we're going to have Dr. Paula Green speaking about Hands Across the Hills, which is her work bringing together Americans across the political divide. So she has done some deep dialogue work with a community of progressive liberals in Western Massachusetts and a community of very conservative Americans from Kentucky and Appalachia. And she's been working with those two communities since 2017. Her work was recognized by much media coverage, especially now as we have been talking more about some of the divisions. So our focus is always on applied nonviolence and how can we take some of the rich practices that have been developed, often under very challenging circumstances, and apply them to the conflicts that we might be facing here in this country or elsewhere. So it's our interest at the center is in giving example to applied nonviolence. So I'm very, very pleased to bring to you tonight Mr. Charles Alphin Sr., all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, a man of remarkable accomplishments. He's served communities across this nation and around the world in as many ways as you can imagine, oftentimes working with people in danger or at their most vulnerable. After he received his Bachelor of Science in Law Enforcement and Criminal Corrections from Northeast Missouri State University, Mr. Alphin served as a law enforcement officer for nearly 3 decades in St. Louis, Missouri, during which time he held positions of patrol officer, detective, juvenile officer, sergeant, platoon lieutenant, and captain. During the last 10 years of his career, he was commander of units that included homicide, child abuse, and narcotics. In other words, this is a man who has seen human beings in their violent choices. In 1992, after retirement from the St. Louis Police Department and at the request of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Captain Alphin and his wife moved to Atlanta to work at the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. In 1994, he was promoted to Director of Education and Training for the King Center. Since his retirement from the King Center, Mr. Alphin has worked as a senior trainer and spokesman with Lafayette and Associates, an organization started by Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr., who served on the executive staff for Dr. King and trained Mr. Alphin in the philosophy and methodology of Kingian Nonviolence in the late 1970s. He has trained at-risk youth and other students, gang members, local educators, college professors, community leaders, clergy, law enforcement, and correctional officers all across the United States, the Caribbean, Central and South America, Europe, and Middle East and Africa. In 1994, he spent 4 months in South Africa and assisted in training nearly 250,000 South Africans in voter education and nonviolent resistance. One of his highest honors was to witness the historic South African election and inauguration of President Nelson Mandela. He and his wife Joyce still reside in Atlanta and are the proud parents of 2 adult children. And just last month, I believe it was the state of Georgia at their 36th annual commemoration for Dr. Martin Luther King, gave Mr. Alphin the Charles Robert Lewis Lifetime Achievement Award. So we are so grateful that he is here to be with us tonight to speak on Kingian nonviolence and policing, a topic that is very much on the minds of many people, especially here in Worcester. We are asking that everybody remain muted, please. You can put your chat questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to keep track of them. Mr. Alphin is going to speak for about 30 minutes. There'll be a couple of directed questions, and then we'll open it up to the community. And he has very generously said that he's willing to stay on. We typically run these for about an hour and 15 minutes, but for those who want to linger and have exchange, Mr. Alphin has graciously said he would stay on. So welcome to all, and welcome, Mr. Alphin.
Okay, and thank you for that very kind and warm introduction. At one point I was asking myself, who is she talking about? I hadn't done all of that, I didn't think. But I stand on the shoulders of other people that have taken their time to teach me. And John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian, Dorothy Cotton, and Ella Baker, and all those people who took time to teach me about the philosophy of nonviolence. I am honored and excited to be here with the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, and glad that we're able to have a conversation. I am not an expert. I have experiences where I will share. Nonviolence is dynamic and it's creative, and it's not something you teach to repeat like you teach training to repeat. It's applicable to family problems, church problems. It's a universal application that Dr. King saw on how to reconcile conflict. And I'll talk a little bit about reconciliation and resolution, the difference. But he saw this as a way of living, not just something you apply when you have problems. And before I start on my lifestyle with the story, violence is a word that is sometimes misunderstood. It's not completely identified. A lot of times the definition is not incorrect, it's not complete. So Dr. King took violence, as Gandhi did, to psychological, mental, economic, gender, all types of violence. Anything that violates the human spirit is a form of violence. Or when you lower a person or don't permit a person to reach their full potential, that's a form of violation, it's violence. Sometimes the psychological violence is much more devastating than the physical. For instance, most of the time, a lot of times, we're more violent to the people we say we love by the way we talk to them, our siblings, our spouses, our mother-in-law, and church. So this philosophy of nonviolence is universal and can be applicable and applied in all areas, all disciplines. And I've tried that. Everything I'll talk to you tonight about is my experience in doing it. This is not theory. I have done this before I began to teach it. So all this is my lifelong experiences of working with my family, recognizing how violent I was to my family, the way I talked to my children when they were coming up, and into workforce. So therefore, and females. So Charles Alphin. Charles Alphin was born in St. Louis, Missouri. My mother was a school teacher. Father was a superintendent at the post office. And I had a typical African-American life, I thought. I lived in a segregated neighborhood in St. Louis, Missouri. And when I was 9 years old, I saw in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper that African Americans could swim in the public pool at a public park. So I rode my bicycle against my mother's orders because I was not allowed that far from the house. But I violated my mother's orders and my father. And when I got to the park, there were white people lying around the park with sticks. And they beat me, took my bicycle and tried to hang me. And I was 9 years old, and I didn't realize, why can you hate me? You don't even know me. And therefore, I began to get a bitter feeling toward whites. And I stayed in the segregated area. I went to high school. In my high school, we didn't have any whites. It was all black. We couldn't go to the white high schools. And we read the books that were from the white school. Pages were torn. I had 40 people in my English class. Some of them didn't have chairs. Some of them didn't have books. But we learned. And I thought I was typical. Then I graduated from high school and went to the service. And I found racism in the service. I went to the stockade for fighting because I used to love to fight. I belonged to gangs when I was coming up. And I carried a weapon long before I was a police officer. In my community, that's what we thought was the way you live. Everybody lived like that. When I graduated, when I got out of the service for 4 years, I came back to the St. Louis and I joined the St. Louis Police Department. I was following my brother, my big brother. And when I went to the St. Louis Police Department, I met racism head up. In the St. Louis Police Department, as most police departments do, they have selective law enforcement. The people in the upper class, upper middle class, or upper level, which happen to be the Europeans, they don't get police like they do in Black neighborhoods. Selective policing, selective police enforcement. And that's typical. When the police department first started in St. Louis, a Black police could not arrest a white. And we graduated from that, but they had some areas when I was working, we had projects like Chicago, 13, 14 stories high, 30, 40,000 people in 2 blocks. We had projects. And when I was a rookie, I had to walk the projects of the city of St. Louis. And policing was different. Back then, there was no police brutality. When I was coming up as a child, as a young boy in St. Louis, there was no police brutality. Police were ultimate power, and the politician gave the police the power. In fact, in my neighborhood, if you complained against a police officer and went to the station about getting beat, they would beat you again in the station. Nobody would come, no complaints, no juvenile code. It was the ultimate power of the police, and his badge and his authority let them search homes. There was no such thing as a search warrant. We would just kick the door in and say, I'm the police. And so we put up with that until 1967, when the Supreme Court got involved in policing in the United States of America, and they began to monitor police, the Supreme Court. And that's when the search and seizure came in. Terry versus Ohio said you can't search people's homes or cars without probable cause. And that's when the Miranda law came in, where you had to tell people that they were under arrest and you had to get them a lawyer. So the Supreme Court began to monitor police behavior because the community was complaining. That was like the 1967. I joined in 65. So therefore, they were trying to say, what does law enforcement do in a democracy? What's that balance of justice? What's the freedom that we enjoy? And how do we modify that? And we're still struggling with what a law enforcement officer does in a democracy. And I've trained in communist countries in old Russia, old Soviet Union, and been in Cuba. And but in a democracy, we're struggling to see how do you protect the rights of people and the rights of police officers. And we haven't got it right yet. So we're going through a growing pains. And that's why we're having so much conflict, because our courts are involved, the laws are changing, the people are demanding more. And we've got to now begin to see how do we balance this. So my experience brought me to the police department because I had been violated by the police department. I did a lot of things, mischievous and things, and I sometimes deserved to get some misconduct against me. But a lot of times they just stopped me because I was black and pulled my car over and turn all the seats out and call me the N-word. So I joined the police department because I wanted to see if I could help people and not violate them because I had been violated. So in July 21st, 1965, I joined the police department as a rookie, St. Louis City. And my bio, I got consumed with that blue, they call it the silent, the blue barrier, where you're in a fraternity and you don't talk against your fellow officers, you don't say anything, and you just go along with whatever comes down and not violate that blue code. And that's still today. It's not as strong as it was in the 60s, but it's broken a little bit, but police officers just wouldn't talk against other police officers. That was a violation, high violation. So I went along with that because I was trying to fit in with people. For about 5 years, I went along with I did some things that I'm ashamed of because I was caught up with that blue code that we just didn't talk. And then I began to understand why was I in the police department and how was I violating people and how did I feel? And about that time I met Dr. Lafayette, and I had a conflict with my son in school playing football, African-American, with academics. And Dr. Lafayette met me at a parents' meeting, and he sat in the back of the room and listened to the parents who were very angry with their school system. And long story short, he helped change that system. He didn't tell me who he was, did not tell me he worked with Dr. King and the strategist. He didn't tell me he's in every history book. He just instructed me from the rear. He led me from the rear. And then 7 years later in 1981, he said, Charles, let's go back and see the Freedom Rides for 1961. And he was on the Freedom Rides, he and John Lewis. And he said, let's go back and see how far Blacks have progressed or regressed. That was 1981, 20 years later. And we took an airplane down to Jackson, Mississippi. That's where Freedom Rides were supposed to end. And Honorable Andrew Young interviewed us or met us, orientated us. And we got on the bus, John Lewis, Dorothy Cotton, Reverend C.T. Vivian, Jim Bevel, Diane Nash, all the people. I hadn't really heard of them, but I got on the bus with them and we began to cut back through the South, stopping at all the historical sites. And we spent 9 days. And my roommate was Reverend C.T. Vivian and John Lewis. And I could remember the day that I was asking them, you all changed all of this in the South and you didn't shoot anybody or didn't whoop anybody? Because I was fascinated of the change they had happened and didn't use any violence. And when we got to Dexter, when we got to Montgomery, Mrs. King met us. That was 1981. And she met us on the bus. Dr. Lafayette was the director of the Summer Institute at the King Center in Atlanta. And I attended my first workshop in nonviolence at the King Center. And when I heard the speakers and talking to the people that have done this, I was hooked. I was a sergeant in the police department, and I went back home and began to try to enact this in the police department. I would take my vacation and come down to the King Center from St. Louis for like 8 years, every summer. I would learn a little bit, take it back to the police department and try it. I was in a district that we had 9-year-old kids selling crack cocaine at 12 o'clock noon. St. Louis is the murder capital of the world. We kill more per percentage than New York. We're always the third or fourth killer in the nation. And so I was in a district that had drugs and killings, et cetera, and gangs. And I would try this back home, and I did that for 8 years. I took some young people down to the King Center from juvenile detention. They had been involved in gang shootouts. I took young people that had been sleeping in cars from selling drugs at 14 years old. So I would get a bus, I'd go to the judge of juvenile detention, and I'd say, I'd work with them for a couple of months, and then I'd say, you want to go to Atlanta? and learn more about this, because nonviolence doesn't mean you don't fight, you just change your weapon. Nonviolence does not mean you don't fight. It's not praise the Lord, let the Lord change it. No, that's not Kingian nonviolence. So therefore, you change your weapon, you do fight. So I would take them down to the King Center for the training on the summer, and the judge would let them go under my custody, and I would tell them, you know, I had a busload, and I would tell them that I brought you to a nice hotel, it'd be 2 to a room, and I'm not gonna handcuff you, and if you run, you're gonna embarrass me, but I trust you and I love you. And I did that for like 7 years. Not a one ran, nor they violate my curfew or my rules, and they would come back to St. Louis and they would go back in juvenile detention. The correction officer would meet them at the bus, the church, and they'd take them back in detention. And that was really a lesson to me about what love can do. We'll talk a little bit about that, because they knew I loved them, and they knew I wasn't judging them about what they had done, and they had done some pretty bad stuff, but they were converted, and they began my teachers. I would take them to the Carter Center in Atlanta, and they would teach the teachers why do they act up in your class, and what they can do to begin to get to them. And the teacher would say, that's the best workshops we ever had. And that the teacher would stay over, listen to the young people. And they were the people that would train with me in Atlanta. And it would gang people who are involved in violence teach this better than most people, because they have a reference, and they know it doesn't work, but that's all they know how to do it. When I was in homicide, I did a self-survey on why people kill. And I talked to young people that killed, and they would go to McDonald's and get out McDonald's, and they would say, Captain, I had to kill them. What else could I do? They dissed me. So I'm beginning to find out that people have the will not to kill, but not the skill. And most people kill one time. And we don't have a lot of research on why people kill. So I was very concerned that I was a good homicide investor. I could catch a killer. I wanted to stop the killing, because catching a killer is after the fact. I wanted to be proactive and stop it. And I began to do things within St. Louis, the police department, within young people, working with the police department in Atlanta. And I'll stop there, but there's just so much that we can do with young people. Dr. King said people involved in the problem have to be involved in the solution. So therefore, when you have people that are doing disruptive behavior, you've got to find a way, and we can get their attention and get them to help us solve problems. And that's what we do, because rather than tear up the school, they should be making sure that the classroom is conducive for learning. And so we've had examples in Detroit, New York, California, where the students set up an atmosphere that's conducive for teaching. And that's what we do. Now, that's enough about Charles Alphin. I came back from the Soviet Union in 1992, and you said I retired, came down to the King Center. I was supposed to be going to New York. New York has a Dr. Martin Luther King Institute, the state. And I was going there as the director of the center. And Mrs. King called me and said, don't sign any papers till you see me. And when Mrs. King talks, you listen. So I went down to Atlanta and joined Mrs. King. I did not go to New York to be a director of the Institute. Well, I'll stop there. Since then, I've been all over the world. I did my first trip with the Fellowship of Reconciliation out in Nyack, New York. When I was a consultant in New York for the state, Harry Belafonte, and was able to form an institute. The first institute in the United States was the Martin Luther King Institute, the New York Martin Luther King Institute. And the challenge was for the education, training, and research of Dr. King's philosophy. And Dr. Lafayette, myself, and David Jansen, we were consultants and trainers. So I went to the Soviet Union twice, taught the KGB, and did lecture at Moscow University of how could a communist country revert to policing and for the people. And then from there, I went to India, studied Gandhi, and the difference between Gandhi and Dr. King. Did lecturing in India. Radhakrishnan was the curator for Gandhi. Been to India at least 4 times, and Cuba, Haiti, South America, so all over the world. And in Nigeria, We started in Nigeria in 2007, and we trained the militants who were blowing up the oil wells and kidnapping. And those were the guerrillas, and we trained them. And a lot of them had not even picked the book up. They hadn't read if they'd been fighting the army. And South Africa was dangerous during the time of Mandela and the Zulus and Bootlacy, and it was a little dangerous in Colombia. But God's blessed me and given me a passion that I can take. And they say, well, aren't you scared? Well, no, I've come to the conclusion that you can't take my life, I'll give you my life. Because when people can discourage you by threatening to kill you, they control you. So I've come to the conclusion in my later days, and the 40 years I've been training, that you can't scare me, you can't take my life, I'll give it to you because I believe in this. Now, what do I believe in? Number one, Dr. King was very narrow. There's volumes of books on nonviolence, and when we're in Palestine and Bethlehem, their idea of resisting, when we were there, they would go to the wall in Jerusalem on Friday and throw rocks at the tanks. And they felt that was a nonviolent resistance. So we had to help them understand, no, that was not nonviolent resistance. We trained them. We have about 100 trainers in Palestine that are teaching this. So there's volumes of books on nonviolence, but Dr. King was very narrow. In fact, he was eclectic. When he was searching for truths, he would pull the best of a philosopher and put them together and call it the Kingian Nonviolence. And it's different from Gandhi. It's different from other volumes. And he developed this after 21 years of school. He was born in Atlanta, and he experienced racism, and he said, how do I change this world? It's sick, the United States. He couldn't get a weapon or something, so he said he was a minister. Father was a minister. So he went to school, and he began to get mentors that began to teach him the education and also social change. And in 1949, he heard Dr. Malachi Johnson in Philadelphia. He had gone to listen to a lecture, and Dr. Malachi Johnson had just gotten back from India, talking to Gandhi, and he shared with him Gandhi's philosophy. And Dr. King got so excited, he bought all the books he could buy, and he began to study the philosophy of Gandhi and other philosophers, Rauschenbusch, Hegel, Reinhold Niebuhr, all the great philosophers. And he said that God gave him the spirit and the goal, and Mahatma Gandhi gave him the method. So when he came out of school after 21 years, he had offers at Yale and offers in California to be a minister, and they called him to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. When he first went to Montgomery, all he had was an intellectual understanding of nonviolence, all book learned, didn't have anything practical. But when he got to Montgomery, Mrs. King said that God just had, it was divinity that God put him there, he and her there. And he was selected as a leader of the bus boycott. And he began to teach the people what he had studied intellectually. So God gave him a human laboratory, and he had all the intellectual. And so after he applied that, and we take what he applied and teach that, because it's really a struggle in nonviolence. And after every movement, Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma, he wrote a book. And so in the first book he wrote, Stride Toward Freedom, he explains why he chose this philosophy, called it Appeal to Nonviolence, chapter 6. So that's what we teach from. He developed 6 principles and 6 steps. And as you do the action, you have some issues up in Massachusetts where you live. And as you do the action, you have to adhere to the principles. If you don't adhere to the principles, it's nothing but another problem-solving process. The uniqueness about Dr. King is that there are 6 principles that you have to adhere to as you do the action. And if you don't do all 6 of them, you're not practicing Dr. King's nonviolence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, well, let's see, what is it? Nonviolence is probably the most misunderstood word, I think, in the English language. And I'll read you a definition, and I'm going to show you a little clip video that will explain a little bit more. Dr. Claiborne Carson is a professor of history at Stanford University and Mrs. King chose him to write the King papers. And so I have a 4-minute clip from Claiborne Carson that we're going to listen to in a few minutes, but I think he'll explain to you what this is, and then we'll go over a little what it is and what it isn't, Claiborne Carson. But let me read to you a definition of it, and then we'll show we have manuals, books that we teach from. We'll show you the manual, the 2-day core, and then we'll listen to Professor Claiborne Carson give you a 4-minute explanation of how Gandhi, when the African Americans met Gandhi, nonviolence comes from the Buddhist and the Indian word ahimsa. Ahimsa means doing no harm to any living being, ahimsa. And so Dr. Gandhi was not an English word to match ahimsa, and Gandhi ushered in nonviolence. So you'll hear that in the clip. And let's see, nonviolence. Let me give you a definition of nonviolence to start with, and we'll come back to this. Nonviolence is not simply a method of protest, but a system of thought, philosophy, art, methods, and strategies whose purpose is to bring about complete change. I'll read it again. One definition of nonviolence. Nonviolence is not simply a method of protest, but a system of thought, philosophy, art, methods, and strategies whose purpose is to bring about complete change. Nonviolence is never spelled with a hyphen. If you see it spelled with a hyphen, it is not Dr. King. That is incorrect. Nonviolence is a noun. I don't have time to go into that, but the English hyphenated nonviolence is not what Dr. King was talking about. So therefore, I've been in esteemed institutions and they spell it with a hyphen. That is not Dr. King, and they're explaining Dr. King. So let's take a look at the book first, and then we'll go into the with Professor Claiborne Carson. Where is, can we put the book up, please? The first thing. Yeah, this is the booklet that we took out. Dr. Lafayette wrote a book, The Leader's Manual. It's the PhD of the Leader's Manual. We have level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. And this is the first 2-day core orientation that's taken out of the Leader's Manual that Dr. Lafayette wrote. And we feel that this is enough people can consume in 2 days. Otherwise, it's overload because it's very specific and it's non-traditional. So we teach this, and then you graduate to the training of trainers, like Rob is a training of trainer and been to Nigeria with me. And then we go into degrees in your specific discipline with a focus on nonviolence. We have people who have their PhD in that, and that's the book we use. But let's listen to Claiborne Carson, who is writing the papers of Dr. King and a historian, a professor at Stanford University. Can we play that clip, please?
How did King define nonviolence? What, according to him, were its key principles?
I think, first of all, King and most other advocates of Gandhian nonviolence define it as resistance. That it's, in a way, I think both King and Gandhi were uneasy with the term nonviolence because it says what it's not rather than what it is. And I think for both of them, there should be a more active term. And I think that King would always talk about it, first of all, as resistance, strong resistance, resistance that has a lot of spiritual and sometimes physical power behind it, because it's the power of bringing large numbers of people into a struggle as opposed to a violent struggle, which is almost inherently a small group of people. And so I think that he would define it as resistance that tries to achieve a goal that does not involve the destruction of the other side, that involves trying to, as he put it during the Birmingham campaign, or I think even as early as the Montgomery campaign, it's not to defeat white people or white authority. It's to empower justice and to bring justice into the relationship between those in authority and those who are subordinate. So I think the question for King is, how do you do this? And he and the people in his organizations developed a set of ideas and that tactics and strategies that made sense in terms of trying to bring about a result that was sustainable. I mean, one of the goals of any movement is not only what you win, but how do you keep what you won? And nonviolence does that because it helps change the ideas of those on the other side. And once those ideas have changed, then you don't always have to use violence to keep whatever goals you've achieved. I think finally, I think for King, it was a spiritual concept that had to do with his notion of religion. That religion was not just an institution, the church. It was a spiritual idea that there is a moral force in the universe, and as he put it, that it bends towards justice, and that a movement that is in concert with that moral force can achieve a great deal. So I think that for him it was a much more complex idea than simply the notion that it's simply a refusal to use violence. It's a willingness, a desire to use other tactics and strategies that are, in the end, more effective.
We'll talk about that because that's a 2-week training for what Professor Carson said. But let's see now. Number one, nonviolence is not to win over your opponent, but to win your opponent over. So the issue that you're dealing with locally, your focus, your goal has not to win over the people you disagree with, but to win them over. And that makes it more sustainable. When I was in St. Louis and I was in fighting, the more I fought, the more I had to fight. Dr. King said, violence begets violence. So therefore, nonviolence is not a passive, weak position. Andrew Young says nonviolence is aggressive, organized goodwill. It has to be aggressive, it has to be organized, and it has to be for the goodwill of your opponent. So therefore, it's different. It's non-traditional. It's taught that you don't an eye for an eye. I'll give you a little bit more in the missing facts, but let's go now to the first screen about conflict. The first screen about conflict. Dr. King was not trying to eradicate conflict. The second one, I'm sorry, next one. These are 4 major types of conflict that we become involved in as human beings. Dr. King that saw that conflict can be constructive if it's managed. So Dr. King's whole thrust was to manage conflict, because when you have 2 or more people involved, you're going to have conflict. And when Dr. King first married, Dr. Lafayette first married his wife, they had some conflict, and he went to his mother-in-law, and they were discussing the conflict. And his mother responded to the young newlywed. She said that when 2 people agree on everything all the time, one of you is unnecessary. So we're not trying to, can we just all get along? No. As a police officer, I wanted people that would disagree with me with courteous, and if they made sense, I would follow them. I didn't have a monopoly on brains. So therefore, I put people around me that had different opinions. And Dr. King would listen to his staff for sometimes hours on end to hear their opinion, both sides. Andrew Young would argue with Hosea Williams. And then Dr. King would synthesize both sides. So therefore, we're not trying to eradicate conflict. Nothing moves in the universe without conflict. If your organization doesn't have conflict in it, it's not moving. Not moving. So therefore, these are the 4 types of conflict we look at as human beings. Pathway, the same overall goals, but different methods of reaching them. Normally, this is the community and the police. The police may say strong enforcement, warrior mentality, and the community says, no, we want a little bit more humanity to this. We want the same goal of a peaceful community where the people can, live and thrive in. So the conflict becomes when you discuss how do you achieve your goal. And in most issues in the community, you can you can put it around to a pathway goal. The community and the police want the same goal, but they disagree on how to achieve the goal. And then I'll go down to the last one is value because of our time. We teach this in our class. The last one is value. Value is the basic foundations of most conflicts. Where do you get your value from? You get your value from your experiences, how you interpret your experiences. So when you walk into a community, a room, a church, you've got different people there that have different experiences and how they interpreted when they were young. You normally lock in your values around 12 years old. And values are the basic foundation of most conflicts, your values. Dr. King said in the 60s that this nation needs a revolution of values. Our values are diluted. So these are the 4 types of conflict, distributed, mutual exclusive that we become involved in. But let's go on now to the next screen and let's see what this thing called nonviolence is. And I'll elaborate a little bit on, we can go to the next one. I'll elaborate a little bit on Trayvon Carson. Number 1 says nonviolence is only effective when you outnumber the opposing force. I'll read all of them and I'll tell you the answer. You can think about your answer as I read them. Nonviolence is only effective when you outnumber the opposing force. Number 2, nonviolence, this is Kingian nonviolence, is the opposite of violence. Number 3, demonstrations, protests, and confrontations against legal authority describe nonviolence. Number 4, Dr. King was successful using nonviolence in the 1950s and 60s, but things are different today and they won't work. Number 5, nonviolent solutions tend to be more permanent than violent solutions. Number 6, in some circumstances, violence helps to produce nonviolent solutions. In fact, some people say Malcolm X set the table for Dr. King because they would rather deal with Dr. King than Malcolm X. So number 6, in some circumstances, violence helps to produce nonviolent solutions. And number 7, and by the way, we teach Malcolm X and Dr. King, and they were both great people trying to have salvation for their people. So Malcolm evolved, and after Malcolm came back from Mecca, he changed. So we do teach that. We don't teach Malcolm unless you read Malcolm. Number 7, Dr. King is given the credit for discovering nonviolence. And can you roll that down a little bit more? Can you roll that down just a little bit? Let me see the pictures. To my left there, that's Dr. King and Dr. Lafayette. Dr. Lafayette was the national chairperson for the Poor People's Campaign. He was also Dr. King's strategist. So Dr. Lafayette was very close to Dr. King, and he said Dr. King would roll up his sleeves and get a blackboard and teach when I'm talking to you, how I'm doing this, and he would teach it to his executive staff. Dr. Lafayette was with Dr. King 5 hours before he was assassinated. And he still has his key. Dr. Lafayette still has his key from the Lorraine Motel. So he hadn't had a chance to mourn because he's been doing what Dr. King told him 5 hours before Dr. King was assassinated. He told him that, Bernard, we need to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence. And that's what we've been doing, following Dr. King's orders of institutionalizing and internationalizing nonviolence. Institutions last longer than programs. Okay, let's go back to the missing facts. Go down. The only one on there that is a fact is number 5. The rest of them are false, myth. The only one on there, number 5. Nonviolence, number 2, I'll do a couple of them before I'll ask for questions, but number 2, the opposite of violence. Nonviolence is not the opposite of violence. The opposite of violence is peace. And Dr. King and Gandhi separated peace into 2 words, negative peace and positive peace. And negative peace is when there's violence or there's, well, let's just say you have negative peace when you have the triple evils in your community. And those triple evils that Dr. King identified in the 60s was racism, poverty, and militarism. And as long as you have those 3 triple evils, he called them, in your community, you have a negative peace. And they all support each other. Racism, poverty, and militarism or violence. And so Dr. King said true peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. True peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. If you're in a home that you're being abused and you just take it because of the children and you're quiet, that's called negative peace. It's the absence of, not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. The other thing is that nonviolent, number 5, tends to be more permanent because as in the video you heard, it's the characteristic of the change. In fact, in your change in the city and your issues that you have, as you begin to solve the problem, people ought to see your solution in the means. In other words, you can't use destructive means to create constructive goals. So in your issue that you're dealing with, you have to see in fact, Dr. King said that ultimately you cannot use violent means, destructive means to produce constructive goals. So therefore, Gandhi said in my philosophy of life, my means and my ends are convertible terms. So as you're trying to solve issues in your community and the family and the church, your means has to be your means has to be consistent with your goal. You cannot talk nasty to a police chief or a manager or a city council and say, I want peace and understanding with the community, because your method, your means has violated what you say you want. That's why it's more permanent, because it's the characteristic of the change. It's not to win over your opponent, but to win your opponent over. How's my time? Okay, 5 more minutes. Okay, let's roll down and let's see let's come down. You can ask some questions behind there when they have questions. The next one. As we look at conflict, Dr. King used a Hegelian. Now, he's a German philosopher, and it was a Hegelian approach to a problem or issue. And he said that when you have an issue in your family or in the community, the truths are in the whole. That if you're trying to solve it by how you see it, you only have half truths, because truths are in the whole. And you have to be careful that you don't go to the extreme polarities of each end, the thesis and the antithesis. So therefore, you have to take a look at the issue and be able to state your opponent's position just as well as you can yours and how they arrived. If you don't understand your opponent's position and can state it just as well as they can, all you have is a debate, because Hegel and Dr. King said truths are in the whole. There's threads of truths. And if you see that diagram, you see the thesis and antithesis, and then you see the threads of truths, and then you have a synthesis. That's going toward nonviolence. A quick example if you want to stop gangs and selling drugs in your community, selling drugs, let's say gangs in a community, I guess you all have gangs in Massachusetts, could be wannabes. You have to understand the gang position because there's threads of truth in people who organize gangs, threads of truth. And those threads of truth, as I see them across the United States when I do this, talking to gang members, they do it for family, for belonging, for safety. So if you're going to, and they do it for drugs and beat up people, that's not the truth. So you pull the truth out that they're looking for family and safety. If you don't deal with those truths that they see it, you're not going to reduce the gangs because you're not dealing with truths as they see it, the threads of truth. Your children have threads of truth. Threads of truth. And when you're mature enough to not only listen, but to hear, the difference between listening and hearing, when you can hear your children and pull out the threads of truth in their position, you have a higher truth called a synthesis. So this can work in family, it can work in communities, but you have to do some work. You just can't get a group of people and say, let's go protest and start singing We Should Overcome. That's not strategic, and it's not following Dr. King's philosophy. Okay, well, that's called the Hegelian approach to problem solving. Hegelian. Hegel was a German philosopher. And guess what? Hegel didn't like Black folks. He was a racist. But Dr. King said, I want something to help my people. I'm not concerned about what your attitude is. So he didn't pull all of things from Hegel, but he did pull this. And Hegel was a racist. So therefore, be careful how you label people. Sometimes you'll miss meeting your goal. Okay, let's look at the last one. These are my resources, biblical. Now, in studying, these are some things that you want, if you want to go into reading. Dr. King wrote 4 books. I met Miles Horton. Miles Horton is a 1, 2, 3, 4. Most of you should know Miles Horton. He had the Highlander Folk School. And he brought in September Clark from the South Carolinas and turned over the voting project to Dr. King. Miles Horton was a young man that lived in the hills of Tennessee. And Rosa Parks came there. He was putting blacks and whites together, which was against the law. They burned down his place, called him a communist, but he still brought in how do you begin to enact the diversity. And Miles Horton passed, years ago, but he was one of my teachers, and he still has Mr. Frank Adams runs the Highlander. I think it's educational school now, not the folk school. But Dr. Martin Luther King, these are the books that he wrote where I'll pull from. And these are some things if you want to. Taylor Branch does an excellent job on Parting the Waters because there's lots of books written about Dr. King, and a lot of them are incorrect. So these are people who have correctly identified and have articulated Dr. King's philosophy. So I'll stop there. I think my 5 minutes up, and I know I went fast, but we have 2 days of training and to sit and debate, struggle with it, ask questions, because when I heard this, I just knew it would work. And I had all types of questions for Dr. Lafayette and Mrs. King and C.T. Vivian. And so we facilitate an adult learning, so we don't force feed. Wow.
Thank you so much. So you've given us a tremendous amount of material here. And for this next section, I'll ask a couple of directed questions of Mr. Alphin, and then please, people are welcome to put your own questions, responses to what you've heard tonight in the chat box, and then we'll try to curate that. Several people have asked about, will this be recorded? It is being recorded, and it will be up on the center's website within the next few days. So I put our address in the chat box. It's very simple. It's nonviolentsolutions.org, but you should be able to see it there. And I think there's also a link to the PowerPoint that, Sean, if you don't mind just putting that up, if you can find it, because I sent it in your email. So If we can put that in the chat box. If you can't, don't worry about it. We'll try to make sure that people can access the resources that Mr. Alphin provided in the PowerPoint. But my first question, Mr. Alphin, is you have done trainings for police departments using this approach. And that's very radical in and of itself. How can you talk a little bit about how you've done that? What are the areas of where police are listening to the material and resisting it? You know, there's pushback. Can you tell us about some of the successes and also what didn't work when you tried to bring this to them? Because it's very important when we're applying nonviolence that we look at the failures as well as the things that work. So how did you bring this to the different, you worked in Miami, you worked in Texas, a real geographically varied, you can mention a few of the departments that you've done the trainings in and then speak
absolutely. It's strategic of how do you intervene and when do you intervene and who intervenes. Policing is a closed society and they'll circle the wagons on you and they'll meet you to death. They'll send you to committees and they'll burn you out on purpose. So therefore you have to understand the nature of the beast, the culture. We can get into them because we've experienced policing. And we know the language of policing. Number one, the number one thing policemen are concerned with is their safety. If you come in with a shoot, we call it shoot, don't shoot. Of course, you're gonna lose them immediately because they wanna go home safe. So our training deals with de-escalation, solving problems without violence, alternatives of violence, but it doesn't deal with shooting and safety. The state deals with that. Police officers have the exact rules and regulations when they use deadly force. The Supreme Court gives them the rules of the Supreme Court, the federal government and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has modified that in the years that you can't shoot at fleeing automobiles or people who are running. So you have to make sure that you're saying, you know the rules and regulation of the state and the federal government. And if you violate those rules, you have to have accountability. And we teach the police department has to have accountability if they violate those rules because those are state use of force. And so we don't go in with safety as far as their safety, challenging their safety. We go in and say, okay, here are the principles and the steps. When have you worked this? How has it worked? Most police officers do these principles and steps and we're unconscious that they do them. You can't shoot everybody you come to. You don't run in, most policemen fire their weapons once or twice their whole career. Most of your problems are just domestic conflict. And so you have to use other strategies to get people to calm down. I use humor. And we go over the police officer and say, okay, when did you use this principle? I have a police manual that I wrote, I told Rob, and the New York police officers in the police academy and the Miami academy, they changed all this language to law enforcement language, the 6 principles and the 6 steps. And all this, what I just told you, they changed that all to law enforcement language. And I have written a book on law enforcement. And that's the book we use for law enforcement and corrections. And the other thing is that they have to trust you, that you know what you're talking about. They have to trust you that you've been in the same situation they have and you understand them. And you know when they're just beating their lips and trying to feel like their job is so dangerous and all that. So you have to sift through all of that. And they have to trust, they have to know somebody that they know can sift through that, because I've done it all the way from patrolman. I've been shot at least 8 times. I've never killed anybody, I've never shot back. But everybody that tried to kill me, they have been apprehended. So therefore, it's what we call top down, bottom up. You have to orientate the top and train the bottom. Because if you don't orientate the top, they'll sabotage it. They'll sabotage it. So therefore, the way we go into in the police departments, we start at the top. And we show what we have, and we also bring the union in, because the union is, you have to include, if you all have a union up there, I'm sure some of them have associations, and you have to talk to the unions. And they have to understand what you're doing. And then we have to bring all the top commanders in from the mayor, city council, and tell them. We normally do a 45-minute, about an hour orientation, and let them ask questions to make sure they understand what we're trying to do and the whole philosophy. Because the speed of the leader, the speed of the game. The tail falls ahead. The chief has to come in and say, this is my project, and I expect it to work. So we have the chief come in, orientate, the chief and the mayor, the city council, whoever that's the organizations, you know, and leadership. And then we go to get police officers who want to be trained. We've had some officers that are sent there mandatory, like in South Carolina and New York. It's harder to pull those people when they don't want to be there. And so we ask them to get people that are either in the training division of the police department or field training officers, FTO, and get them into the class. And they want to be there. So what happens in the class, we go over experiences that they experience every day in the streets, and we say, how does this fit in? How does this work? Could you have done it better? And the police officers begin to explain to each other what tactics they use to de-escalate, because every police officer has their tactics. I'll give you an example. In Miami, I think it was Miami, could have been time, I'm lost now, but we, on domestic quarrel, when they say they come to a house and the wife and the husband fighting, and they have a child there, this officer said he fakes a heart attack and falls on the couch. And the other partner said he's having a heart attack. And the people forget about their conflict and begin to offer help for the officer. I can't do that, but he said it works every time. So I don't challenge what he's saying. If it works every time, the other police hear it. Another one they said is that when they're arguing with parents, he'll go in the child and say, the child looks hungry. Come on, I'll take her to get something to eat. That child is something where both of them love, and they forget about their issue because there's a love in that child. So these police officers do this all the time. And all we did is codify and say, look, if you want to get them to the criminal justice system, you can do that without violence. Now, if you want to just beat up on people and show them you the power and violate people because you don't like their color, you're going to get caught and go to jail, because the system has to be accountable, and the system has to be accountable to the public. As far as your complaints, when you complain, you should get back some results within a certain time. If people don't respond to a telephone call when you call, there should be some consequences behind that. I had police officers in the project, they wouldn't go because they were scared. Projects were dangerous in St. Louis. So I had to tell them that this is what you're here for. And when they call them, I expect you to show up. So there's a lot of things that we do, but it's more or less understanding the culture and understanding what officers are going to listen to. And then letting them see that you do this all the time. We're not saying what you do is wrong. Incorporate this. And then they take it home with them, because policemen have tremendous conflicts at home. They work different hours. They miss children's soccer, et cetera, and they have conflict. And the women love them. So they have conflict, and they can take this home with them and begin to use this, not just in their police work, but as in their home with their conflicts with their wives and the people that say they love. That's a short answer, but it's how you come in, understanding what the issue was, understanding the politics behind it, understanding who's up for election, the city council. All this is part of the strategy of how do you get in. And then you've got to get, once the police officers get trained, they'll spread the word for you. So our whole objective is to train the police how to teach this. and we monitor them. In Providence, Rhode Island, with Rich Tarlian, we train the police officers, and then we stay with them for a month. And the bigger they got, the smaller we got. So we want to give it to the agency so they can keep it going without us. And then they do it with all the recruits that come in, takes this course. All the in-service training, when you go back once a year for in-service training, they take this course. So therefore, it's like you practice your firearms. You have to qualify once a year. You have to go back and qualify and get refreshed with nonviolence. So there's a whole strategy that we do a comprehensive approach to it, and then lead the organization with the capacity. Now, after we get the police trained, then we come to the community, because the police will tell us, we can't do this without the community. In Spring Valley, New York, and all where I've been, Miami, they stopped the first day. They said, look, we need the community. So we bring the community in. Now, some communities are not ready to meet the police because there's been so much strife. So sometimes we'll train the community and the police separate and then bring them in. So we have all types of, depending on what the issues are. I think in Upper New York, there was a lady that said if she had to call, she was so angry with the police, Schenectady, that she said, she's an older lady, and she said, if something happened to me, I wouldn't call the police. That's how angry that, and I never heard that. I've heard that in foreign countries, but I never heard that in the United States. So we have to work to get that in, because the community and the police, that's the power of the whole emphasis. And it's six stakeholders in the community that we want to train, six stakeholders with the police. I'll stop there because it's a whole strategic based on what the chief and the manager goals. They want the community. We want all the NGOs in, the activists, everybody, and that's where we begin to teach it. That's a long response. I'm sorry, but I wanted to let you know that it takes a lot of study and strategy.
Yeah, no, that was a great response, and we're really grateful. Could I just ask, who are the six stakeholders? Are they, like, when you're working on the community side, who are the six stakeholders that you would consider have to be?
I didn't mention the 6 steps, but Dr. King has a philosophy and a methodology. The 6 principles are the wheel, and the 6 steps are the skill. So therefore, in a community, whether it's high economics or no economics, there's 6 leadership groups that can carry nonviolent traits. Number 1, youth. That's all youth. Youth who are doing negative behavior, and also the young people who are doing well. Young people. Youth are the first thing. You never want to lead out the youth. The second one, all faith organizations, not just Black Baptists or segregated faith. Anybody in that faith community and no faith. The next one are the businesses. You have to get business involved in anything that you're doing, because number 1, they'll help you out with cross-training, economic development, all the things that you need. Businesses will help you. The next one is the educational system, K through post. You have a lot of universities up there. You got to get those universities involved. They're going to be our leaders. The next one is the government, not just the police department, the judges, juvenile court, corrections. When people go to jail, they don't stay there for life. They come back to the community. And a lot of times we leave out corrections. And when I was reducing the murder rate in St. Louis, I brought the judges in, because the courts are booked, because there's so many homicides take a long time. It jams the court docket up. So the judges will help. And everybody has in that criminal justice system, not just the police. And then the next one are volunteer associations and women's associations. You want women and volunteer associations. The media would be a volunteer association. And you want all, is that 6 of them? Did I go through 6? Now, what you want to do is, before you do any issue or any problem, you want to frame the issue. Frame the issue means you're going to the source of the problem, not the symptom. Black on black crime, drugs in the community, shooting, those are all symptoms of a much bigger cause. Dr. King and Gandhi never worked on symptoms. So we teach you how to peel the onion to get to the core. What's driving that behavior? And you put that issue between the power and the concern of the people. and you use the 6 principles, not to devilize the power or sell out the people. And that, what we call a whirlwind, creates, that's what the movement is. The people concerned and the power. The people's concern and the power. An example of that was Montgomery. The protest did not solve the problem. They protested for 381 days. The bus company was owned in Chicago. They said, we'll go out of business. We'll never let blacks ride the bus. But the Supreme Court, because of the characteristic of how they dramatized the problem, the Supreme Court said segregated transportation in the United States is unconstitutional. And there were no blacks on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court changed and solved the Montgomery bus boycott, not the protest. The protest dramatized it so that people of goodwill would come to support. People of goodwill will not come to your side if you're shooting guns and throwing Molotov cocktails and killing police officers. They will not rally around you. So therefore, it's the characteristic of the change that attracts people of goodwill, not just black people. Your issue has to cut across racial, ethnic, and cultural lines. It has to be a people issue. Single race issues are hard to solve because the other races opt out. So in your framing the issue, you have to put a people issue in there, not a race.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. Someone's hoping you'll come to Roanoke, Virginia. And we've put the document up with the PowerPoint. There was a question here asked in the beginning about how do you engage opponents who don't want to engage, who have no interest in dealing with you?
Well, number one, you can't force people to listen to you. If that person is a power leader, because we train leadership, the power, if that person leadership we identify as having influence. If that person is somebody that you need and that's instrumental in moving it with the power, you get a third party. You look around and see who else can get to that person. I'll give you an example. There's thousands of them. That's all strategy. When we were in Haiti, we worked with Cedrus and the other person that left out of Haiti, Aristide. Okay, when Aristide left Haiti and Cedrus took over. And we were trying to get Cedrus in Haiti and Cedrus and Aristide to talk and stop the killing because we didn't take the political side. We said, look, we need to stop the killing. And Cedrus had taken over and Aristide had been exiled. The United States was paying him money. So we were trying to just stop the killing in Haiti. And we couldn't get to Cedrus. Cedrus didn't want to listen. So we got a conservative white businessman in Haiti. And just before we met in Haiti, there was an African congressman, I won't call his name, that had disrespected Cedrus after he met. And he said, I don't want to meet with any other black people. I'm not going to meet any other people. So we got a conservative white businessman. And we told him what nonviolence was and what we wanted to do. And he got up on the table and went to the phone and called Cedrus. And he came back and said, can you meet him tomorrow? And we said, yeah. So he said, you got 45 minutes. And Cedrus met with us for 45 minutes. But at 45 minutes, he got so excited that it changed to 4 hours. And he called all his generals in. So therefore, when you have people that are resistant, look around and see who else can, who's the best person to get them. I'll give you one other example. I got 1,000 of them. We were in New York at a black church at a picnic. And a white police officer came in and they thought somebody snatched a pocketbook. And the little boy didn't snatch it, but he ran in the lake. And he started hollering for his mother. And the policeman looked around to see who was the best person to go in and get that young person out of the lake, because if a policeman went in there struggling with a 10-year-old girl, it's going to be a problem. And he solicited his aunt to go in there and get the young girl. So therefore, in nonviolence, you look at who's the best person. Okay, just because you're the leader doesn't mean that you're the best person to negotiate and get people in. So it's a strategy of finding out who's the best person to approach this. And there's a lot of other things we look at. but you have to make sure that you're not the best person all the time to do. There's other people that you have resources.
We have a question here about where can people get these trainings and in Kingian Nonviolence. And so, yeah, let me deal with that one first, and then I'll take the one after.
Well, since March, we've been doing virtual training. I just had a virtual training. My mind is going blank now. What was it yesterday? I've been doing so much virtual orientations. But normally, I'm also the senior instructor for the King Center. This is Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter. I work with her. They have training at the King Center. Dr. Lafayette, now we do training. It's cheaper to bring us, it's cheaper for us to come to you and you mobilize people in the community because we want to give it to you. What Dr. King did was empower people to decide their own destiny and not do it for you. So when we come in with trainers, it's cheaper to come in with an organized group and do that. And we like the training of trainers because we want to leave it with you. Not that we put you out there by yourself. We'll technical assistance stay with you until you're ready. But we can get it, if they stay in touch with you, and this pandemic changes, it's cheaper to come in and do it with the community because the community has to have a project to work. How you bond with the community is you start on working on something small. All those 6 stakeholders and the police and the community, and work on something you can solve in 2 weeks. And forget about all the litigation. In fact, all the things that you're having with it in court, we don't talk about that because that's not fair to the officer, it's not fair to the victim. So anything in litigation, we don't want to talk about that because that's a violation. But the community has to work together on a problem. I'll just say it very straightforward to you. The people who are doing wrong things in your community, they love the conflict you're in now because the policemen are not doing police work. So the people who are selling drugs and doing bad things, they love it when the community and the police are fighting because the policemen slow down work and they can do the drug people and the thieves can run wild. So that's a negative. That's another negative you have when you have 2 people want the same goal and the thieves are opportunists.
Sorry, the next question is, can a community have its own security and safety that is entirely nonviolent? I believe I'm representing that question correctly from John Fairfield.
Yes.
Or does there need to be armed police to call in as a last resort? So can a community address all of its security needs with nonviolence?
Yes, you're looking at what Dr. King called the beloved community. Dr. King's end goal was the beloved community. And he said, we live in a world house now, and we got to figure out how to get along with each other. And if I'm in one bedroom and another ethnicity or race is in another bedroom, I have a problem, I can't burn the house down because it's my house too. So we live in a world, and we shrunk this world by technology. So therefore, yes, he felt that we can reach what we call the beloved community. And that's a community where you lift everybody to their fullest potential. And you will have conflict, but you solve the conflict with a nonviolent way. So can policemen walk without guns? I think so, but not now. It has to be worked up on that. It has to be a social statement of the community. But we've been involved and saturated with so many guns in this United States, it would be difficult to tell policemen to put your gun up. Now, even though you carry a gun, your heart tells you when to use it. So I carried a gun for 26 years, and I never shot at anybody because I'm a Christian. My Bible says thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill unless you're a police officer. So that's individual with me. That's Charles Alphin. So therefore, not now. The guns, people would subject themselves to harm if they went out policemen went with no weapons. But Dr. King's whole vision that we can do this. If we can go to the moon, 300 million miles away at 12,000 miles an hour, we can conquer this. So yes, that's my passion. I may not see it But what we're doing now, we're planting the footprints for unborn generations. And I have faith that we can do that. Yes.